Ralitsa is going to start for us on the topic of youth-oriented literature and Bulgaria's gateway science fiction.
Hi everyone. Hi everyone. Maybe we can dial the light down a little bit. Is the lunch excitement over? Okay. So, as I said, I stepped in for a colleague who had to present something very interesting, but hopefully next year. And since I don't have a completed paper for this talk, I will tell you a little bit about my research on this book series. I briefly maybe mentioned yesterday the guided tour. I have in the exhibition 2 covers for the series. So this is, I'm going to start with the story of the series, then we're going to go on with my presentation. But this is the most popular series for pulp fiction in Bulgaria. They take place between 1979 and the series end perhaps in 94, but the actual end for me is in 1989 when the artists of the covers stop doing them, and then they switch focus to movies. They publish Star Wars. It becomes kind of a mess of things. So for us, the fans of the series is between 1979 and 1989. The series is popular with, as I said, with its covers, but also with the fact that it's the only series in Bulgaria with the maximum number of foreign, and that is Western foreign, publications. So this happens in the 80s. There are many things that we have to say about Bulgaria in the 80s. But for me, as a researcher, it's very interesting why in the last decade of communism, the most turbulent decade where changes are starting to announce themselves slowly, why do people are obsessed with science fiction? Why do people, and this is like everyone, ladies in the stores, young people, their parents, everyone is reading it. The books were coming out in something like between 100,000 to 300,000 copies, which is absolutely unmatched volume of publication for Bulgaria until this point. If a present-day publisher hears the number 100,000 copies, they'll have a heart attack. It doesn't happen anymore. I think the biggest Bulgarian book in terms of volume of publication is 10,000 last year. So this book penetrated the entire Bulgarian society. Maybe 4 or 5 generations grew up with them. And until today, they are very loved. With what they mark themselves so much in the audience's mind, I don't know, because it's a big combination of stories. You have of course the Hitchhiker, Ursula Le Guin, who is everyone's favorite. I think the most celebrated book is Dune, actually, from this series, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it later. But as Emilia Karabova noted, what's most exciting about the series is not that much the books, although they're very exciting as well, but they were a little bit edited. Many of them were translated from directly Russian, which means after the Russian editing, then here in Bulgaria it comes the already digested, politically digested text. Most of them were translated like this, the American ones. But it seems that for the covers represented more of excitement. And so how are these books designed? Let's go back with the story. So these books were designed after the Western format of paperbacks with very interesting covers. The founder of the series is called Milan Sadurov. He's a sci-fi writer. He's an avid fan of Strugatsky. Also, he interprets Strugatsky in Bulgaria. And he was the one who convinced the Varna publishing house, which was one of the biggest publishing houses in the country, to start doing science fiction. I have an article from 1989, 10 years after Galactica started, where Gopal Kunyan, who is a very important, he's a sci-fi writer, but most importantly he was an intellectual activist for science fiction. He was a poet. He founded the Armenian Studies Department, really jack of all trades person, very important in contemporary cultural history. So he was the one who actually took the idea and said, okay, we're going to try it. And in this article in 1989, he talks about 10 years from Galactica, of which, so in every book Galactica, you have this very cool logo, you have this list of editors, chief editors, and these are not editors of the books. I'm going to tell you a little bit later how this works, because this is the core of my little talk today. In every book of Galactica there are these, 7 names. Among them are the biggest sci-fi writers, the biggest sci-fi critics. We have, for the Bulgarian audience who know them, Lubendil, Fetuza Zlatarov, Ralitsa Konstantinova, Agop Melkonyan, whom I just mentioned, Yeditepe, Bogdan Sapatos, Svetoslav Slavchev. And these people are like the instrument which makes Galactica and publishing of this type of science fiction happens. These 7 people are this committee, designed in a specific way by the initiator of the series, who says to me that he has arranged the editor committee in such a way that they are in two opposite positions, so there's always balance of power and there's never change of position. I don't know in detail what he means about this, but he says that it's conceived to be a buffer between the Committee of Print. The Committee of Print, for those of you who don't know, is a body in the government, of course, during state socialism, which is responsible for everything that comes out of print. That means everything. It's a form of like censorship instrument, although officially it's not. And it's where the decision of what comes published or not comes. So every book has to be approved by them. And of course, they don't read all the books they have to approve. They have this, how would you translate it, Red Collegia?
Editorial board.
Editorial board, that's the correct one. Exactly, editorial board. So this editorial board is the one that has to argue for each book. Like for instance, 1984 was proposed a number of times and of course never passed through because it's but many things passed, but many other things that are quite provocative. The third book in the series comes Return from the Stars, which is a straightforward critique of the socialist regime and the desired socialist utopia. The people from the publishing series says when this was coming out, everyone was saying we're going to go to jail for this. They didn't go to jail. They published many other things which struck in the heart of the audience in a very exciting way. But the book itself as a design was something very foreign. I remember when I was a child, much before I started reading, you have the big panels with libraries in every socialist house. There is a big shelving section with books. I don't know, those of you who live that way maybe remember. So Futuristic dominates with book, and among them, the bright colors of Biblioteca Galactica's bags are completely taking your attention. How does this happen? The initiator, Ivana convinced Agop Melkunian to start talking to the publishing director to make a paperback series with science fiction. However, science fiction was not considered a proper literature genre. Science fiction was something which is fictional, which has no educational purposes, and which is something that doesn't have merit of proper literature. These 7 people were collected this editorial board to convince that that's otherwise. And those very interesting, completely, you can read them in 1 second books, always have between 3 and 10 pages, really hard in language, really complicated, very sophisticated analysis which presents them on the front. This analysis serves as legitimization of the text. And these are like, as much as the books are super readable, the forwards are completely unreadable because they're written by like scholars, it's completely scholarly language, and that is on purpose. So, how did they got all those books? How did they get to know what they have? I mean, how did they get to know the story since it's all Iron Curtain? There's a lady from the Museum of Modern Art in New York, I forget her name, who was here studying something ancient here in Bulgaria, maybe the Thracians or something. She was collecting evidence in Varna, and she was instrumental to bring a box of 400 books, or 200 books, I'm not sure, some 100 books, to be translated and published in Bulgaria. So she basically smuggled them. The books, she didn't smuggle, she sent them from New York as a part of her program. They got immediately arrested. This is the story of the arrested books. They got immediately, the books got arrested. And the initiator of the stories, Milana Sadurov, who is the editor in the Varna publishing house at that point, he's called in the secret police to explain how does he get these books, who sends them and why. And there's a very interesting story. We mentioned already the purge in Moldova Guardia in 1973. So what happened is Milana Sadurov convinced the secret police that these books are already published and approved in Russia because they're published by Moldova Guardia. And this was his argument to release the books. And the police who allowed that did not know at this time that same Moldova Guardia was completely purged on the same ideological conflict. So this is actually the paravan behind which Galactica happens. However, penetrating the entire society and having, so when Galactica books comes out, you cannot buy them in the bookstore. They immediately disappear. They become clandestine. You have to buy them on the black market. They cost more money. If this costs, let's say, 2 levels, you have to buy it for 10. Because the moment the book arrives in the bookstore, they disappear. And there are lines of people, the people who grew up reading those books will tell you, there are lines of people in front of the bookstore to get, when the first delivery arrives, maybe to try to get some official copies. People read them together, people distributed them between themselves. But how did such a massive publication, in very, sometimes, in confrontational with the regime stories inside, how did this go unnoticed? Miguel Coach earlier said that it's true, there is no very direct control regime as many people abroad imagine. And yet, it is not possible that such a huge book series left unnoticeable by the authorities. And here comes one very interesting concept in the ideological practice of the party in the late years of the regime, of which we're going to tell you more with Emilia Karaboeva next time. But it's called social releasers or social vent. It's a concept of the party which intends to allow a little bit of freedom in order to suppress the growing tension. And it was a complete, clear, directive ideology. And Galactica is one of those things that were considered part of this vent. Galactica, the editors of Galactica claim that this is one of the biggest impact events in Bulgaria, and it's part of this politic of allowing the Beatles, allowing the longer hairs, allowing American science fiction. Where this plays with the youth literature. I told you that the relationship between the party control, let's say the Committee of Print, the publishing house, and the readers is for me a triangle that forms the life of this type of culture, like the science fiction culture, is formulated by these three sides. On one side, on top, I was drawing some strange triangles earlier. I cannot show you. But for me, it's exactly a triangle of, on one side, the Committee of Print, which has to approve, which is served by this editor board. On the other side is the publisher and writers. The publisher and writers and the readers are connected by the fan clubs, which is a huge institution during socialism, and people who have studied or have been part of these clubs will tell you that it's like an instrumental institution for science fiction during communism. And this triangle is of different interaction which are dependent to each other. Because it's very important, and this is if we have to get the whole conference in a nutshell, we're going to say what the Provost Emilia said. Science fiction on one side propaganda, on the other side for the people appropriated as a form of cultural resistance. And this for me is very interesting to understand because we have the participation, the active participation of the readers, of the public in formulating these different uses of science fiction. And when we talk about cultural products, because what is forbidden in communism? It's forbidden certain ideas, cultural products, media, this is forbidden. And this is a value of cultural production as culture in the sense of art and intellectual work, is the value of cultural work as seen by the readers. Not only that, but in science fiction we have global readers. Like for instance, Galactica were buying original rights of the foreign writers from a Serbian Belgrade-based company. Why? Because all the writers, science fiction writers, even during communism, will meet each other in conferences, and they will discuss who is published where, so they're going to know. So you cannot hide behind the iron curtain what you publish or not. What you can hide is the volumes. They sign for like 1,000 volumes, they print 100,000 volumes. And to conclude this kind of hectic presentation of part of my work, I'm going to read you some of I grabbed the first two Galactica that I saw in my room, to read you example from this editorial board texts. And one of them is luckily Hungarian, which is cool because we have Nicholas here. Where is Nicholas? Nicholas is not here, okay, great. I was hoping he can provide some comments to that. So I'm going to translate a little bit of how the editorial board and the different people hired by the publishing house are defending certain publication. So I'm starting with James White, Galactic Hospital, Irish author, quite well known. Here's what the editor, who is, in this case, // part of the editorial board, great writer of science fiction, great critic of science fiction, instrumental for the development of Bulgarian science fiction, and so on. So he says, to compose intelligent creature from outside of alien intelligent creature is not complicated. In science fiction, there's thousands of aliens who, some of them look like us, and following the anthropocentric theory, all the intelligent creatures in space look like us. In other visions, they're all sorts of things. They're thinking amoebas to planets that themselves have brains. But it is not so hard to create the aliens, but they will always remain imaginary decors of made-up fantasies until we see them in humanitarian measurement. Then goes on and on and on about the hospital. And then he says, indeed, the main idea in the Galactic Hospital is that every living creature, whatever it is, it has the right of help by the great intelligence. This is complete rejection of all xenophobic and language of hatred in science fiction. This is the idea that reflects the human world as humanism, fighting against racism, and helping for the needy. So you can imagine this is a story which has nothing to do with those things. It's about a hospital. It's a story about how the aliens of different shapes and form are receiving help. But the way the editor commission, the forward reads it, is in some very humanistic, general, philosophical, representing, of course, the ideals of society. If you read the book, that's exactly not the. When I was doing research of the books, I would always read the book first and then read the forward, because otherwise it's going to get me to think some completely different things. Not always true. Sometimes the forwards are very good. Sometimes they're like very deep, especially when they're for Eastern Bloc writers. They're then much more detailed and much more honest because they don't have to seclude things. The highest humanitarian idea of white is protecting with this professional mastership the idea of human rights in space. This is one of the examples. I don't know if you can grasp from such little examples, but here you go. This is a Hungarian writer. Didn't it also arrive suddenly? No, Rosie, right? Hi, Rosie. So this is a book about some people who are left in some planet in some other time and have to get help and reach to Earth to report for their important findings about this planet. And they're struggling to do that. It's very, very hard struggle. But here, I'm going to finish with that. Georgi Krumov tells us he's not part of the editorial committee, but he's invited to do forward. I don't know if he's not a translator here. Let me see. Interpreter? No, interpreter is Yupangov. So I don't know why. He's probably an expert on Hungarian literature. I don't know. He says the activists of science and of the highest artistic achievements of the science fiction genre start its creation from the vast, impressive, and still not so. I'm sorry, this is not what I want to read. Sorry, this is. Okay, so in the beginning of the 20th century, the grasp of science fiction gave the revolutionary wave which has grasped entire Europe, and especially Hungary, the development of technical and scientific idea together with the political one. And to understand it faster, like any other intellectual and spiritual sphere of development, the fail of fascism and the socialist reconstruction of life gave a push to the science fiction writers whose works were completely taken over by social and moral optimism. This is again a address of the book which has nothing to do with the story. The story is about some people who struggle with their equipment, with some alien, and they're going back and forth in time. Has nothing to do with socialism, has nothing to do with, especially with the fall of fascism. And for me, I just want to share with you today the importance of this mediating body. I don't know if you could get examples for my rough, fast translation, but I had to step in 2 days ago for this talk. So it's a bit hectic, but I wanted to show you precisely because of the following previous talk, which describes certain relationship between the imagined regime altogether and the sci-fi writers. I wanted to tell you that it's a bit more dispersed as an interaction, and it definitely has different angles. Very important angle is the readers who are dictating what is happening, the writers, the fan clubs. And so it's like a circle of interactions. It's not a direct line of demand. So nobody in the ideological section of the party has read this book or has considered what it has. Instead, there are certain people and certain mechanisms who have roles to negotiate for something, and many books take years to pass through this type of negotiation because not always it's accepted. Sometimes you have to go apply again. Sometimes it never happens, like with 1984. I'm going to stop here because I can talk 3 hours about Galactica. I'm just finishing my book about it. I don't know if you get what I said, but if you have some questions for me to try to clarify, I'm going to be happy to answer after. So I'm going to stop here.
Okay, the second paper is Jessica Valisa, and who was working on East European Studies at the University of Bologna, and her paper, as you can see, is called To the Stars: Space Exploration and Futuristic Visions in Late Soviet Science Fiction Books, Children's Books.
Hello everybody. That's the research that I have been doing, and I stumbled on upon this argument just by case while doing some voluntary work in Russia in a children's library. I came across these books that are books, not science fiction books, but books of popular science, and they're written into children, and they were written in order to familiarize children with space travel, in order to prepare them for an upcoming conquering of the cosmos. And that's something really interesting I found about. Like, in this process, I read many of these books, and then I chose 4 books that I thought were really kind of describing some kind of narratives that I found, and that was somehow strange, because the books I want to talk. Can we go to the next one? I think you should. Or,
Clicker.
didn't see it. Okay. How does it work? Okay. Okay. So the books I've been focusing about are books that are written during the time of stagnation that we already talked about during the Soviet times. So when the space discourse lost its appeal among the populace. But in these books, these very same narratives of space exploration and a great expectation for the future that were present during the Soviet space age, during the Khrushchev's times when the Sputnik was launched, and so they persisted. And I wanted to verify this connection, see how this previous discourse is still present in books written in another time, and then I also tried to find a reason why this narrative was persisting in a time that was characterized by different concerns. So, well, a bit about the introduction. That's the space, as I already said, the Soviet space age was a short but important time during the Soviet Union. It was the precondition was the de-Stalinization brought about by Khrushchev, and the technological progress that the Soviet Union was facing in those years. So were years of expectation, as someone already said, were the years where the communism was thought to be near, to be approaching in one generation time even. And so there's the launch of the Sputnik, and then the first manned mission, manned flight of Yuri Gagarin, and all these Soviet space force, they brought about a kind of space frenzy that reflected in many different parts of the culture, in popular culture, in literature, in fashion, in collective. For example, you can see here how that vacuum cleaner design was influenced by this space culture. And yes, another important thing that I want to emphasize is the importance of childhood and the connection between the cosmos exploration and childhood, because I think was one of the main features of the Soviet space age. There was, as we said, this proliferation of cosmonaut clubs all around the Soviet Union, the flourishing of science fiction literature for children, space-themed toys, the playground that we also saw yesterday at the exhibition. And because the cosmonauts, they represented the socialist hero, so they represented the man who is both very intelligent, knows about the star, the cosmonaut, and is also physically fit. It's the new man that is going to realize communism and also to expand this vision to other planets. And the children, they were perceived as the ones that will be able to make this vision happen. So it was really important to give the children the education in order to be able to become one of these future cosmonauts that will master the cosmos. And then this connection at the result of connotes space exploration with innocence, with playfulness, with discovery, and this as the result to downplay the fact that the Soviet space program was a military program, and this is also very dangerous, and several cosmonauts died. Thanks to the realization of communism, that was also possible through the technological development. Like we can remember the project of electrification of Russia, or all the avant-garde art that was expressing this striving for the town, this striving for the future, for the technological development that would have been actuated in Russia, that was still very backward country. And then the other discourse is the one of cosmism, that also other people talk about before. And here the humanity must conquer the cosmos in order to fulfill a mission, an eschatological mission, a kind of mystical mission. And Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, that was a scientist and the so-called father of the Soviet space age, his research was motivated by occult vision of perfection in the humanity through conquering the cosmos. And he thought that by conquering the cosmos, the man would have become like God, to elevate like his status. So these two different discourses, they share utopianism and the fact that the thinking that nature must be controlled by man. And that the technology would have transformed society. So briefly about the books that have been analyzed, they've been written between 1974 and 1984. They have been published by the official Soviet publishing house, Детская литература. The first two are by the author Pavel Krushantsyev, that we already heard about. He was mainly a documentary maker, but he also wrote these books about space exploration. The first one is about the moon, and it explains children like the moon and the moon phases, how the moon is a satellite, what's on the other face of the moon, the craters, mountains, all these things. And then the second part talks about the mastery of the moon. So talk about the first mission, unmanned module that touched the lunar soil, that was the Soviet Luna 12. And then the competition between Americans and the Soviets. In order to be the first on the moon, and also they described that yes, the Americans were first without any hatred. Also, but then the most interesting part is the last one, because in the last part the moon will be colonized, and then it's going to happen in, they say, like 1 generation time. So the children of today will be among the one who will be colonizing the moon. The second also about by Krushantsyev. It's House on Orbit. It's about orbiting station and explains everything, how orbiting station works, what's orbit and how orbit, how can you put like satellites around the Earth, and explains of this stuff and what nowadays orbiting stations are doing. And also here, the second part, it's about evolution, how orbiting station will evolve. And here you can see like in this design what will be the task that will be provided by the orbital station, and how orbital station will also change the life on Earth. The third one is a bit of an exception among these books because it's aimed to younger readers, I think until 10 years old, and it's called I Want to Become a Cosmonaut, and it's about the adventure of this brother and sister and how they discover about the cosmos, how they go to the museum, how do they go to the library, and they get familiarized with Tsiolkovsky and with telescopes, and at the end they themselves fly to one space mission. The last one is AZ of Cosmonautics, and this is much more pedagogic in response to the other because there is no narrative device in it. It just explains everything about rockets and space science. And here the future rhetoric is a bit downplayed, I think. but he used a lot of science fiction-like imaginary, which I found really interesting, and I decided to include in this presentation. Well, then, so about the narratives. One main narrative is the future of the space exploration. In all these books, it's stated in one way or another that in a few decades, people will start exploring the cosmos to begin exploring other planets, Mars, Venus, and beyond, and will be beginning the process of mastering of the cosmos. In all this book, humanity moves from ignorance to knowledge. At the beginning, there are also shown these kind of mythologies about the past, how the past people thought that the cosmos was working, then they start talking about Galileo, and mostly about Tsiolkovsky and the Soviet space program. They make it more Soviet in the way how the Soviet people managed to know about the cosmos and to actualize these successes. Well, I want to become a cosmonaut, so they say that the cosmic era has started in a preface addressed to parents and educators, and that this book is written so that the children are prepared to face a future in which many jobs will be connected to space exploration. In House on Orbit, life on Earth will be transformed and simplified by the advent of long-term living or a station where a lot of people will live and work even for like periods of 3-6 months of time. In Moon Station, the Moon will become like a second Earth at the end, thanks to the effort of the Soviet people. And in the AZ of cosmonautics, it's also stated that the children of today will be for sure the cosmonauts of tomorrow, that the process of conquering Mars, Venus, it's close, but he wants to help children to understand that the universe is complicated so they can appreciate more. And I think all these narratives that I found are really consistent with the one of the Soviet space age, because the flight of Gagarin opened a new world of possibilities, and it was thought that was the base for future discoveries that at the end never happened. But another important topic is international friendship. All these books, they talk in a way or another about international friendship. In House on Orbit, in the orbiting station on the future, people will live together and their work will be benefiting the whole humanity, and then we will see how. In Moon Station, they write about how both Soviets and America tried to get to the moon, and they describe the moon landing by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin without like a recognition of what the Americans managed to achieve, and they also described how the two first astronauts on the moon left a plaque that was commemorating both the American and the Soviet cosmonauts that died during flights or exercitation, writing that we came here in peace for all humanity. But yes, but at the end, the mastery of the moon, there is written, will be completed by Soviet people or communist people of the communist society. That's what's written. And in AZ of cosmonautics, there is a clear connection between space exploration and the emergence of a feeling of brotherhood for all humanity, because they write the planes, they fly above countries, but spaceship and satellites, their orbits, they encompass all the Earth. So for what concerns satellites and spaceship, borders do not exist. And they also describe how the common interest knowing more about the cosmos prompt international cooperation. And also they describe how space equipment parts have been already produced in different countries. And while I want to become a cosmonaut is more focused on the collaboration between the socialist camp about the intercosmos mission that was going on in that years. And they use an interesting narrative device. They talk about these puppets that were brought to the International Orbiting Station by the Soviet cosmonauts and by the first German cosmonaut Zygmunt Jan. And these puppets are one, the Russian popular character Masha and the German cartoon character Sandman. And in the book they describe how they adapt to the life in zero gravity, describe how they have a spacewalk around, and so they use this device to signify the friendship between peoples. So I would say that also this theme of international friendship is reflecting the narratives of the Soviet space age, because it resonates with Khrushchev's doctrine of peaceful coexistence, where capitalist and socialist country can maintain peaceful relation, but at the end, as we know, socialism would have prevailed because it was thought to be a superior economical system, as it is hinted in Moon Station. And then there is this connection between space and peace, space and freedom, space and realization of humanity as a whole. That's also a stronghold of the theories of Tsiolkovsky. Well, then another important narrative is the humanization of the cosmos. And here you can see it, for example, in House on Orbit. They describe the function of future orbiting stations, and among these future there is environmental monitoring. They describe how there is one room where people they work using periscopes. In this periscope they look where some environmental hazard is taking place, and they immediately contact the authorities on Earth so they can take action against it. And I see this like kind of panopticon that from above looks at everything and punishes every kind of godlike, every mistake that has been, any danger that's getting on Earth. And they talk about orbiting stations that will become flying cities, how zero gravity will be used to cure cardiac illnesses. And they also talk in the last page about a space mirror that will illuminate the town at night. In Moon Station, it's interesting because the moon will be transformed in a second Earth by using means that are quite extreme. For example, opening the soil with explosions, so to free the gas trapped there and create some kind of atmosphere. Or they will use satellites, missiles, in order to make the moon move and start for her to have circular orbit like the Earth. And how water extracted from underground will be used to moisten the soil and allow plants to grow there. So here you can see in these narratives how there is this theme of mastery of the nature that is both common in the early Bolsheviks and the Cosmics, and it's also one feature of the space age narrative. But there is also, on the other hand, more modern sensibility about environment and its protection, at least in part of it. And maybe this was might have been accelerated by space exploration, by seeing the Earth from far away as a small house, a small common dwelling place that we all need to care about. Well, then now a bit about continuing, but with visual narratives, because I think are very important. Unfortunately, I don't have the book here with me, even because some of them are in really bad condition, so I was afraid of ruining them. The place of narrative, of visual narrative, is very important because they give children some kind of visualization on how the future will be and how is the man place in the cosmos. As you can see here, one of the main features is how people live in flying modules, how the everyday routine in a very limited space, how people can look the Earth from afar, how people will be working in the cosmos by building living station. There. So it shows the fruits of human ingenuity, it shows the mastery of nature. And here, this is about what I talk now. This is Okay, this before the mastery of the moon, how it is described in this book. At the first page is this. The two kids are like looking at the moon from the earth, and it looks very far away and almost impossible to reach. But then in the second one, the kids, they manage to get to some space mission to the moon, and they're walking around. And now in the last one, in the last picture, they observe the earth from the moon, so that's the other way around. Respectively, so the mastery of the moon has already started, and then here you see then what happens afterwards. That's what's in the book is supposed to start in the next 20 years, which is the colonization of the moon. So there you see all the different equipment that is used to create what looks like to be a first moon station, and then how they talk about like in a matter of maybe 100 years we could live in the moon as in the second Earth, so that people are not wearing any space suit or helicopters are flying, means that there is atmosphere already. Then also going with concluding with the visual narratives, I found this kind of imagery really interesting about conquering the space, about this drawing style. It was thing started by the cosmonaut Leonov, who was an artist, also was one of the first men performing our space work. And it depicts usually a really realistic human-made object like a satellite or a spaceship, with the background of some natural object, usually a planet. And you can see the symbolism of this style, how the man-made object is depicted in a really realistic way, and in the background you see this pastel-like color of a planet. And this is like what man can achieve in the cosmos. Then, of course, these images that are not technical. There are also technical images in this publication, but they don't bring anything new, anything more concrete on the technical side. They're just to showing what the man can be able to. Like, for example, there above you can see a lot of different space devices, all drawn close together to see. And for example, then it goes also more in the science fiction realm. This image, of course, is just symbolic because there cannot be all these planets all together with their orbit also. And this last one, there are a couple of these in AZ of Cosmonautics, which depicts a science fiction future, a kind of space shuttle, some flying saucer, and a strange planet. And this is, I think, is to instill a sense of expectation for the future. Well, going to the conclusion, so we see how the space age narrative survived in a time that was characterized by different problems during the 70s with the, after the American moon landing, after the at times of Khrushchev and the coming of Brezhnev, the Soviet discourse lost its appeal. For some times, the Soviet official discourse had some appeal on the population. In the 60s, the people really believed that they could have been the masters of the cosmos. In this time, this hope was already lost for the 70s. And there was collective disillusionment, and also there were economic hardships going on, and the space program continued, but without much public interest, and was also thought as a waste of money in face of more difficult living conditions for a large part of the Soviet population. Also, political repression increased after the Soviet and Stalinistic, quasi-Stalinistic practice were reintroduced sometimes. So what is my take about these books is that they depict a past future. So a future that was possible to visualize in the past, a future that never happened, that was already not a future at the times where these books were written, and they are mostly about nostalgia for what could have been, but what has not been at the end. And I think that this book, they use the tenets of the official discourse to hide a political stance, because the times of Khrushchev were still the times of promise for a total political transformation, for the advent of communism. And by reinstating these narratives from the Soviet space age, it's, I think, has like the effect of voicing a kind of clandestine opposition to the political system by using weapons that could have been accepted, because these are all official publications, so everything was controlled. And then I also would like to point to the fact that the word revolution comes from astronomy, and it's means like coming back to the departing point, and a revolution describes the orbits of planets around the stars. And I think that talking about all these revolutions, both the revolution of the upcoming communists that was devised some years before, and the revolution of these planets, of the moon, of the orbiting objects, was a way to denounce the satisfactory nature of the present. And thank you.
Okay, the final paper in this panel is Ivana Damnjanovic from Belgrade University, and she's speaking on the novel The White Deluge.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here, but you have to be warned that I'm a political scientist, so I'm really way out of my comfort zone here. And what I want to talk about is a book which had a huge influence on me, actually, and on some my interests, including academic interests, and which was perhaps my entry point, more or less, into the world of science fiction. And also, I would like to try to see where this book fits into the very specific nature of Yugoslav regime, socialist regime. Well, this is now coming from my political scientist persona. One of the problems, it seems, and I think it's more or less consensual with the research of communism in this era and post-socialism or post-communism, is this tendency to lump it all together. While in reality, the state socialism in Russia, Soviet Union, in Poland, in Bulgaria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, was not really that much the same. There were very significant differences. Perhaps the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was the most peculiar case because it was not part of the Eastern Bloc, and it was one of the founders of the non-alignment movement, and was relatively more open to the West in terms of everything, including culture, including science fiction, and the other popular literature. So what does that mean? Actually, this book was not the first, and you can see it is published in 1976. And this is my copy, which I got as a birthday present in 1984. So it's very battered and very well read. But it's actually what would we today call young adult fiction. So it's not really aimed to children, but for a little older readers, for example, some for age 14 or something like that. And how do we know that? Because it was published in a series called Raspust, that means summer holiday, for example. And this was the series that was explicitly devoted to publishing the books for this audience and this age group. As I said, this was not probably my first encounter with science fiction, because we heard today that in different countries, in Soviet Union, in Bulgaria, the science fiction was treated as a sort of educational tool. In Yugoslavia, not so much, but it was for a while treated as a children's literature. So the books that are, whose the main audience is or should be children. What did that mean, and how did that translate into institutional arrangements? For example, these three books with more or less elements of science fiction were at some point between 1950s and 1990s part of the required reading list in Yugoslav schools. So some have less science fiction elements, some have more. Young Bibian on the Moon is by a Bulgarian author, and I believe that some of you are familiar with it. The other, which is really true science fiction, although obviously for children, is Belaev's, I'm not sure what's the origin. Cat is the Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, and it was the space station built based on his ideas, and stuff happens, and adventures ensue. And the third one is actually written by an author from Montenegro. It could be translated as an airship of the Professor Brightmind or something like that. And it also has some elements of science fiction, although it's not really in the true meaning of the term belonging to this genre. This was the dominant, as far as I could determine, the dominant perception of science fiction as something for the children. There were lots of short stories published in various magazines, usually aimed at children. There were some books for younger and older children. And then in the 70s, there was a change of the public perception of science fiction, and there were lots more translations were being published. The series were being started by state-owned, very reputable publishing houses with translations from mostly Western writers, but also Russians, such as Brother Strugatsky, who were mentioned here a couple of times already today. So this book, Beli Potop, was written by this author, Berislav Kosier, who has in his, some of his, not really memoir, but his memories from childhood, he said, I have to identify as Yugoslav because my father was from Croatia and came to Belgrade. My mother was Serbian who also came to Belgrade. And so I have no other identity than Yugoslav. And until the end of his life, which was in 2002, well, after the breakup of Yugoslavia, he identified himself as the Yugoslav Belgrade or Belgrade Yugoslav because he lived all his life in Belgrade. He was a very prolific author. As you can see, he wrote 14 novels. Some of them were translated in a dozen of languages. He wrote dramas, he wrote radio plays, he wrote movie scripts, and so on and so on. And he actually did get many rewards, national and international, but he never got any official state rewards. And obviously it bothered him very much because he pointed that out on his personal website, which he put up very early in, I think, 1998 or something like that. So he was an early adopter of new technologies, even in his old age. So why could it be? Because he also in this memoir, he describes himself as a descendant of rebels and outlaws. And so he always saw himself in that perspective as a rebel and some kind of outlaw. And he was actually persecuted when he was very young for his political beliefs, not necessarily because they were not socialist. And he spent some time on Goli Otok, which was a Yugoslav gulag for those who chose to, because in 1948 there was a split between Tito, Yugoslav communist leadership, and Stalin. And so those who chose Stalin over Tito in this were incarcerated for a while in this gulag. But this sort of repression did not last very long. It was by the end of maybe middle of the 50s, it was mostly over. So these are a lot of books written by Berislav Kosir. Probably his most successful book was a children's book, who was part of which was on the required reading list, Fair Wind, Bluebird, which was also adopted as a Soviet Yugoslav co-production. It's a movie for children. And this is a book where a group of children from different countries come together on a yacht as a prize at some international contest, and also on the yacht there are drug smugglers. So the children organize and save the day. So this was very popular book for that generation of children, but also some of these themes and the plot points, I can say, he also repeats in the White Deluge with another level. This book was also the Fair Wind Bluebird. It was translated, I think, into a dozen different languages. So, what is the White Deluge? This book also, I was inspired by Ralitsa's presentation. This book also has this some kind of short foreword where it's explained what it is and what it's about. And the explanation is, this is science fiction, so you perhaps know what it is. But then it ends on the other page with, well, we know really what it is because it's a kind of popular genre in 1976 in Yugoslavia, so there's no really need. But the other thing is that this is distinctively, in this foreword, designated as negative utopia, which would be today called dystopia. And compared with the books which were already in 1976 translated and published into Serbian, such as We by Sanjatin, such as 1984, but also such as, for example, Space Merchants by Paul and Kornbluth. So these were the books which were already available in Yugoslavia at that point of time. But I had to borrow from Ursula Le Guin and say that this dystopia is kind of ambiguous. So why? Because it does feel like a dystopia. It's very bleak. It's very, well, sad. And the people's lives are quite limited. Their opportunities are quite limited. But this is not the consequence of a totalitarian regime. There is a world state which came in force after the series of disasters, natural disasters, which resulted in climate changes. So how do these changes look? On one hemisphere, you have the spread of the polar ice. On the other hemisphere, you have the spread of the desert because it's very hot all the time. So this was also accelerated and amplified by the negligence for the environment done by people. It was actually started by some sort of changes in the sun, and that ignited the climate changes. But it is said in the book, the Earth's atmosphere was so weakened by the pollution, why the experiments that people did. Let's say he said at some point people said, let's just release all these gases into the atmosphere to see what will happen. And what did happen was that the atmosphere could not buffer the impact of the solar storm when it came. So the population of the Earth is much smaller than it was in the 20th century. There are obviously some fertility problems because women who have 2 children have a pin to honor their achievements, because most women don't have children, have only one. And there is a mandatory service for both men and women in a certain age. For men, they have to spend 500 days fighting the ice on the north, and for women, they have to spend 300 days working in agriculture in those areas where agriculture is still possible. So the survival requires a collective, coordinated effort, and that's the main source of this dystopian feel, because this is a world of advanced technology, but also of scarcity. Because, for example, they do have electric cars, but the batteries they have are not really good, so those cars are slow, they're empty fast, and so on and so on. they have advanced medicine, but the plastic is literally only used for prostheses, for example, hip replacements and stuff like that, and everything has to be recycled again and again and again. And they said, and that is the problem. There is one villain who is a politician, sort of, but his corruption and his, we could say, madness is an individual thing. So it's his problem, not the system's problem. So that is also not really in line with usual dystopian tropes. And this is the Kossier uses one very interesting device, which is a message in a bottle, because the book is a diary of an architect, Zvonimir Mirtel, who was born in a conglomeration, which is Beza 1, which is Belgrade, Zagreb, literally. He put it, he wrote it on a paper, he put it in a canister and sealed it and buried it in the ice, hoping that the ice will melt and that the sea will get his message to whoever. So what happens in a book happens in the 22nd century, but it was published in 25th century when the message was found. So this is kind of useful for two reasons. You have glimpses from 25th century and how when the world is now already a little bit of a better place. And you will have what happens in 22nd century, which is described by the publishers from the 25th, like a sort of a dark ages. And they're like, people were so preoccupied by survival that they could not produce any literature or any lasting records of their daily lives. And it also allows him to skip all the difficult questions, because he does not really go into the details, how this world government is operating and so on and so on. But then, okay, we only know what he wrote in his diary, and he did not write very much about this stuff because everybody knew about that, so he didn't need to explain that at length. The point is, the protagonist and his comrades, a group of several people, end up as a part of their service assignment on an iceberg, which is called the White Reindeer. So why are they on the iceberg? Because the iceberg moves at the same speed as the glacial ice behind it. So if you track and measure the movements of the iceberg, you know you can predict the movements of the ice. And so there has to be a permanent guard, for example, on that. What also happens, and it's more interesting thing, and there is a glimpse of truly dystopian nature of the society at the point. At some point, a group of refugees arrives on the iceberg. Refugees are indigenous families, probably Inuit or something. It's not really described. What are they running from? They're running from the refugee camps where they were displaced, because their old ways of life became untenable, because the animals they hunted have gone extinct in the climate changes and so on and so on. So the decision is to relocate them. They don't want to be relocated, and so they make a run for it and end up on the iceberg. There's also a love story, but it's not very important. But what is very interesting, and it is not something that I encountered in anything else I read, especially from this period, is that here Kossier explicitly states that it would be better to use the indigenous knowledge of life on ice than to try to move them and do things your way. At some point, they heal a wounded member of the unit using well, basically polar bear fat or something like that. But that is not really important. What is important is that they were, first there is a debate, should we let them do it or not, who God knows what kind of superstition it is, witchcraft and stuff like that. But then they let them, and the protagonist is, so the woman doing the healing is chanting all the time. And the chant is repetitive. And at some point, the protagonist realizes that the chant is actually measuring time. That there is 1 minute between, every repetition lasts exactly 60 seconds. So that is, for example, an interesting, apology, or not apology, but whatever, of local indigenous knowledge as opposed to high technology and cutting-edge science, which was usually found in these types of books. So everything ends well and hopeful. Well, hopeful. I mean, they cannot. Yes, but okay. So there's still the ice is advancing, but there is now hope that you can build and live on ice, and that maybe someday the ice will melt. Sometime we find out from the footnotes and from the explanations from the fictional publisher that already in 23rd century life becomes better, and in 25th century it's much better. What is interesting is, for example, that I said that he repeats some of the themes. For example, this theme of isolation. We have a group on a very isolated place who has to work together and comes from various backgrounds internationally. Also, the global state has a global language, which is still at this point not very developed, but it exists and everybody's using it. Also, there is a complete I would call it class equality, because every man is addressed exclusively as a man and every woman is addressed exclusively as a woman. So that's the proper form of address. But for example, gender equality, not so much, because you see you have the different service for men and different service for women. And also, but that can be perhaps explained away by the fact that fertility rates are so low and that humanity is fighting for survival, that, you know, the purpose of women is to bear children, not exclusively to bear children, obviously, but that is important part of their role in the society. How does this, where does this book fit? I'm not really sure, because it's not a dystopia as a critique of the existing socialist state in Yugoslavia. I mean, it does not really correspond to that. Or if it does, it's so subtle that I missed it. I mean, I don't know. It is possible. I don't completely rule out this idea. But what is interesting is that this book is actually very much in line with, for example, the state environmental policies. Because one of the things that were, in my opinion, distinct for Yugoslav type of state socialism is that the authorities, the party, were very adept in using different strategies to release the tensions, to appease the masses. One of those strategies were what I would call co-optation. Whenever some sort of idea or a movement appears from grassroots level, the party just co-opts it and institutionalizes it and presents it as their own policy and idea. So, for example, in the 1970s, this was the case with environmentalist ideas. You had in 1972, for example, the starts on several points in Yugoslavia of environmental movement, and even during the next year or two, it became an official state policy with like statements from Edward Carday, who was the leading theorist and ideologue of the regime, and so on and so on. The same happened a little bit later with the anti-nuclear movement, and so on. So all these movements that could be subversive in some way were actually institutionalized and thus pacified and made part of the official state party line. This book only had this one edition, and is not, lots of people, for lots of people it was the entrance into the world of science fiction, as it was more or less for me, but it was not as popular as some other books. Perhaps it's dystopian theme. Perhaps it's because it was published at the time when the real science fiction was beginning to be published. When science fiction was finally recognized as a sort of, serious literature, but literature aimed not only at children and youths, but also at adults, and as a legitimate sort of legitimate literary job. So that would be it. Thank you very much.
Okay, we've gone a little bit past our time. Not because our speakers kept very well to the time, but we started it late, so I don't know how late you wanted to go.
We need a discussion. We need a discussion. I have a few comments to the Galactica series. It's a curious thing that you and also type of you got obsessed with this series, and there is a lot going on in terms of talking about this series. But I think two things are important to know. There were many things which are not so good about the communist regime. This is clear. But there was one thing among certain things which were good, and one of them was that it was possible to have a long-term publishing policy. So today, with private publishing, this is no longer possible. So the Galactica series was part of a real mania with series. So there was this huge series called World Classics. There was this huge series with different publishers on philosophy. There was a huge series on aesthetics. There was another with essays. There was another with contemporary novels. Lots of series. And there was also, closer to the Galactica thing, there was a series called Adventure and Science Fiction of Narodna Mladež publisher, which was published between 1955 and 1990. They have close to 200 titles in this series. Okay, this was the big books with the hard covers and so on and so forth. But there was the Panorama series, which was published for sure in the 70s. I tried to find the years now, but I couldn't. Which was again the pocket type book with soft covers, which was all of it was translated authors. They have over 200 titles in this series, and some of them are science fiction. So Ray Bradbury is here, Bulgakov with Dog's Heart, Clifford Simak, and other, I don't remember. So one thing we shouldn't forget again about communism, that apart from everything else, there were people with their ambitions, with their ideas, with what they wanted to do. So in this case, this was the struggle of Agop Melkunyan and Saparev, who were the important. Agop Melkunyan was a brilliant writer. He was really a brilliant writer. So they really wanted to have their own policy in publishing this series, and they had to accommodate and make a compromise with the people who were publishing crime fiction. So part of the series is also crime fiction, and there was this uneasy tension between the two. And finally, about the forwards or introductions or whatever they call them, I am the author of the introduction to the Herbert Wells volume in this book. And believe me, they didn't ask, please write an introduction to explain to the party that this is okay. Now, what we had to do in most of these series, this was the beautiful thing, they did have introductions, and the idea was really to give an interpretation, not to repeat the story, not to give an abridged version of the story, and not to appease the party leaders, but really give a context and on a meta level to say what's going on in the book. So, yeah, okay. So it was not only about accommodating the ideological...
I didn't want this, I'm going to start backward to respond. I didn't want to sound this way because I didn't have a proper paper, so I got distracted. First of all, I want to talk about the previous series, which introduced science fiction as exactly young adult fiction, and this is how science fiction was legitimized. This is my idea of a talk today. Then I got excited about the forwards. And of course, I gave examples here that were very rough and very hard translated. Of course, the point of the forwards was not to politically adjust the situation, the story to the text. It was more to justify the text as a valuable literature. And this is what I want to say. I'm sorry if it was a very hectic little talk, but I got really distracted. But of course, the point of these forwards is not to politicize the stories, but it is to justify them as proper literature. Because what I want to talk about is how, from eventually young adult literature, this turns into genre which takes over Bulgaria. Is one thing I forgot. What was the first comment? About the other series. Yes, and about criminal, I'm going to say something curious. So yes, this comes as a paper book. The difference between Panorama and this one is exactly Tekla Alexieva. And this is what makes those so foreign looking. And because the Panorama one was more, who is doing the graphics? It's more minimalistic. Yes. But here, the criminal stories in Galactica as an adventure and a young adult adventure collection was intended as science fiction and criminal stories. There's Agatha Christie, there's the first Raymond Chandler. And what happens with the criminal literature in the series is very interesting, but because there is a Bulgarian writer who had a similar detective, Bogomil Rainov, and when Chandler comes out, and Philip Marlowe, which is very much the foundation of the character of Bogomil Rainov, Emil Boev or something, and he made a huge scandal, and they stopped immediately publishing criminal literature after, because he was having his Bulgarian version of the detective Philip Marlowe, and he didn't like the comparison. So this will happen with the. But thank you for the correction. You're right. It's not a political thing. The examples here were political. I don't know why, because one is American, the other one is indeed about the human virtues. So that's why it's political. But there are many that are not political.
So it's sort of kak, as we say.
No, it's like very serious forward, which very seriously discuss literature. They call top critics to write
But there
those.
must have been some censorship. I can't believe it was free of all censorship.
For instance, I'll tell you. For instance, Dune. What they removed from Dune. You know the stories about the desert planet. So it's based a little bit in the originals on the Arab population, Bedouins, and in this area, and there's a lot of references to the Quran. And this time in Bulgaria, there is the very unpleasant process of how they call it, changing of the names. It's called like a anyway, it's a process in which they force the Muslim population in Bulgaria to change their Turkish names to Bulgarian names, extremely unpleasant period for this population. So at this moment we're not polite to talk about Quran, so this is what they cut from Dune. So yes, things were cut. Some of them are already edited in Russia and translated from the already edited version. So for sure, but the forwards is different. The forwards, they really don't talk about the books, they talk about more general analysis, author, the genre. It's like little lectures on literary theories. They're very serious. They're very different from the actual content of the book.
No, just an illustration from a totally different moment about how censorship worked. Because, of course, you fight for every book, and if somebody heard that certain book was not all right, then there is a problem. If they didn't know anything about the book, there were better chances. But there was this huge scandal in the 60s when a satiric book came out by a Bulgarian poet and an artist, and it was immediately suppressed and taken out, and all the circulation was trashed. What happened? So, Люди Дечушки, there is an article in the leading literary newspaper, which is probably written by Bogomil Rainov, because it's anonymous, and it says that this poet and this artist, they did horrible things with, this is really trashing them. But nothing else against them. So there is only this article and that's it. What happens in between, there is a closed meeting of the city, whatever committee of the party, where they decide to punish the editor and people who are in this committee on Bulgarian, this is Bulgarian book. So they publish people in administrative positions who are fired and things done to them. Nobody knows about them because they are nobody, so people wouldn't know. And they are punished, so they know, and the writer and the artist, because everybody knows them, they are criticized openly, but they are not really punished. So it was not so, they knew how to do it.
I'll give one last example, and this is the book People from the Sea, from Michel Grimaud, which is a French book. It's important that the interpreters are the one offering books very often because they're the one reading them in original. So in this case, the French interpreter, Asi Kadreva, was attacked for this book by the French ambassador in Paris at that time, who wrote a huge article in the biggest newspaper about Moscodelu, saying that this, because it's a very cliche sci-fi story about a post-apocalyptic world with very civilized, hyper-technical people and savages who are free but like living in miserable conditions, who find in the end salvation in the underwater world of sea colonization or something. But she was accused of defending the cause that there is life after the nuclear crisis, And in this case, she was promoting through this book nuclear crisis and nuclear war. And she had to write an explanation to say that, no, I'm not promoting nuclear war. This is just a sci-fi. So it's really perverted the way these things go.
It's indeed eugenics. Let's see what happens.
My last remark.
Well, my question is for Jessica. Thank you very much for your interesting paper. And I have a question. So, can you compare the situation with kids' literature and their exposure to knowledge in the Soviet Union and in Italy? I wonder whether there were these books of similar quality and depth presented to children's audience in Italy.
That's very interesting. Well, I never did any research about these kinds of books in Italy, but I remember as a child reading these kinds of books because I always liked science. And the first thing that came to mind while looking at the Soviet counterparts is that our books about the cosmos were just about planets, and this is the sun, and that's how the sun works, and then there is Earth, Venus, Mars, whatever, all the planets, and that's it. Maybe one page about, I don't know, rockets and missiles, and that's it.
So you mean it's more about astronomy, general knowledge of the universe, and not about the technological inventions?
On the other way, and that's what got me interested into that, is that they are really written to prepare you to go to the stars. Yeah. I mean, Soviet, and then I discovered while doing this research that these Soviet books in general, also these books were translated in different languages, were translated in English, for example, and they circulate in India, and people bought it for a really low price, but in Italy, at least as far as I'm concerned, I never came across this kind of books. And that was interesting for me, to see the difference.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask you, or maybe make a comment to you, and also I'd like to ask Ivana something. I had a difficult time following the chronology and the historical moment of what you were talking about. You said you were going to be talking about literature of 1974 to 84. And one of the things you talked about was the control of nature by man. Now, that was Stalin, okay? Obviously, she's objecting, but she can do that later. Okay, the control of nature by man was indeed Stalin's introduction, and it lasted right until, until he copped it, right in the mid-50s. So I'm curious which text, actually, of the ones you discussed, featured the control of nature by man, because if that happened between 74 and 84, it jumped across the Thaw. The Thaw did not believe in control of nature by man, which is why it had men sobbing their hearts out. And the very title for the Thaw, Otsupir, right, that was introduced, had to deal with nature. Okay, so the period of Thaw, let's say we look at it as being from 1960, let's say 1956, 54, 56, right after the death of Josif Vissarionovich, okay, until 64, 68, debatably, right? That really changed things. So what aspect of stagnation under Brezhnev did this participate in? Similarly, Domna Orbiti, right, is totally reminiscent of the architecture by somebody like Krutikov, who in the 1920s actually had this crazy project called Litaющий город. In other words, what does this tell us about the period of stagnation? Was it an era of selective looks backward? Okay, and we're talking about a decade, was there a consistent looking back, okay, during that period? I had a difficult time following what happened when, I couldn't pin down what you were saying. Maybe I'm tired and old and a bad listener, but I'd like you to tell me. Okay?
Well, yes, maybe I also made it a bit confused because I was emotional. I might have mixed something in my mind. But what concerns control of nature by man and mastery of nature, how is it called in Russian? That I think that comes before the Stalinist time. I read this book that is called The Revolutionary Dream by Richard Stites.
Yes, sure.
And there is all a chapter about the techno-utopianists of the early 20s and how they thought they would have made grand projects in order, I don't know, to give, let's say, better crops to the farmers, so they had to work less, and all this. And also, for example, Maxim Gorky commented in 1920 that with socialism has really started the time of mastery of nature, where man will take possess of his ingenuousness, of his mind, of his intelligence, and will make the world better for all the people. And yeah, what I was referring to in respect of the soul is the utopian revolutionary elan. That's it. Yeah, it's true that during the talk, like this discourse is much more complex, but for example, for what concerns the space age and for what concerns the conquering of the cosmos, there was this idea that cosmos will be transformed by the actions of the human. And that's what I wanted to talk about. It was this revolutionary elan that was then retaken during the years of the Tov. And then it subsided during the 60s, how it was re-actualized in these narratives. I don't know if it makes sense.
I know what you're saying, but you know, it was under Stalin, after all, that we had the Belmore Canal.
Yeah,
Okay?
I know.
That we had also the aviation and so on. You know, the Stalin's incipient ideas really culminated very strongly in Stalin's, I would say, железные правила, you know, that you really had to go. It was part of his militarism, right? Anyway, okay. And do you think that during stagnation, therefore, there was a culmination of previous trends and a recuperation of very early Soviet tendencies?
I think both. I think that these early Soviet tendencies were reactualized during the Tov, during the year of the Soviet space age, and then they kind of declined because of what were the actual conditions and the disillusionment during the years of nation, and they were retaken as a conceptual weapon.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that there was a kind of a lachrymose hiccup, which then could be subsequently ignored, right?
You could say it in that way. Yeah.
Thank you. And I would like to ask you something, Ivana. I loved your talk. And now, first thing I want to know, since I do not know Serbian, has the White Deluge been translated? Because it seems from everything you've said that it tackles so many issues that are very much alive today. You know, environmentalism, immigration, and so on. No, and finally, feminism, sorry.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Is the white in the title politically charged, or is it the ice?
The white is the ice, because the protagonist, one in the middle, he at one point looks from this iceberg where they're at, and on the expanse of ice, and he says, I could not find the other words for that than white dude. So that's his interpretation of what he sees. I don't think that this is translated.
In no other language?
I don't think so. No, I don't. I will. I actually searched. I couldn't find it, but I will search again and I will let you know if I find. Because the one thing that was interesting to me that is really now the themes that this book deals with are very relevant at this moment.
Unbelievable.
Yes.
So.
Probably more, even more than they were in 1970s.
Okay, thank you. It was wonderful to talk, I feel.
Thank you.
That's why no state prize for this writer.
That's
dangerous.
I just want to make a quick note that kind of speaks to Jessica and Ralitsa's talks. It's on the way it works, we're crossing state borders, and the question you were asked about the comparison between Soviet Union and Italy, and you said that those were translated, for instance, available in India. So for sure, in India, Soviet books were super cheap because of state policy to subsidize this kind of literature. And this made me think about the fact that when talking about the Biblioteca Galactica, you were kind of mentioning only the Western books coming in and the books originating from the Eastern Bloc, but you skipped the leftist Western books. For instance, Time Machine of Herbert Wells and The Dispossessed of Ursula Le Guin. These were indeed big American, Western books that were never before available, but it was not really a, it wasn't so politically charged in terms of defending them, saying that no, they're badly already published them and so on and so on. It was just, they were quite leftist indeed, and it was absolutely okay for them to be translated as part of this big series project.
It's just what the leftists did. They were really well
So I really couldn't say much. I just want to give a little accents for my study. It was not an organized talk, but you're right. So what Professor Nikolchin said is true about the long projected series. So Galactica was planned by a formula of publication which lasted until 1989, and the formula was like 30% Soviet bloc, so and so percent Bulgaria, so and so percent, and the majority percent was Western. Of course, certain leftist Western texts were preferred, obviously. But I really like about science fiction how it globalizes the topic of communism. But in general, when I talk about the Cold War, I like to talk about the two-regime system, because there is a lot to say about leftist Western sci-fi, and it's a completely different topic. But yes, there's a lot of that. Last question, because we're very late.
Just very briefly, thank you so much, that was great. So I'm much more familiar with the Western science fiction tradition, so I'm learning a lot this weekend, that's great. But a lot of the things that I do are about this association between science fiction and children's literature as a way of like trivializing it and denigrating it, and that moment that you were speaking about, Ivana, of like becoming serious literature, as you said, Ralitsa, like starting off as young adults and then becoming more mature, and I think that maturing narrative is like definitely there as well in the like Western tradition. But the super interesting thing to me was that the way that you were speaking about it, particularly with the example of like the children's books that Jessica was talking about, that to the extent that it's children's, it's like almost more ideological. It's more like propagandistic. Whereas certainly in the Western tradition, the association is that if it's children's literature, it's like not political at all. It's just like fantastic and mystifying. And so that's more of a thought than a question. I just wondered whether you thought about that. That seems like a kind of opposite mirroring to me. I don't know.
If I may, it depends on how do you want to define political.
Yeah, for sure.
Because, for example, yes, I can speak for Yugoslavia here. They did have all these indoctrination mechanisms, which were quite successful with these youth organizations and lots of activities and so on and so on. Because it was not promotion of, and this was not propaganda in terms of now we will recite you the party line and you will repeat it. It was the identity formation, and it was the promotion of the way of life, of certain values. Well, I'm not that familiar with children's books, being the science fiction or not, in the West at that time or any time, but I'm not sure that they were so free from all these things that I mentioned. I'm not sure. I'm just saying that it really depends how do you define political, and what do you say about the foundational values of a society, which are somehow, because for example, if you look at contemporary science fiction, whether on TV or in movies or somewhere, this shows set in the future, no, there is capitalism all around. There is no on all sides, for example.
Oh no, absolutely. I think they're just more presumed to be like inherently conservative rather than trying to teach you anything new or different, I guess. But that's all. Sorry, I know.
Okay.
Well, if I can also add something to what you said. Yes, children literature in general has the aim of educating children, so there is usually a moral also in story and so, and in the Soviet case even more, because it was seen, literature was seen as a way of forming the citizen of tomorrow, of giving them the good moral values. But about it, I have an interesting example that I can bring you. I think that is not almost limited to children, this kind of heavy ideological presence in Soviet literature, because among the books I came across, there was one of these books about learning Italian that was published in the early 60s in the Soviet Union, and it's practically all ideologized. Like there are, for example, excerpts of famous Italian narratives, but all by communist authors. Among the first things that you learn to say in Italian, there is the word party, for example, and it really reflects really the ideology of Soviet Union at those time, at the time of Khrushchev.
Italy was so communist at the time itself. Italy was so communist at the time.
Well, in the like literature and art, yes, but the government was from the other side.
The Communist Party was very, very strong.
Yeah, it was. So they had a lot of material.
And there is at least one very nice writer, Italian, and Italians don't seem to know him, Gianni Rodari.
Oh, yeah, sure.
But it's possible to, you present this as ideology, but I think it's only just, it can be also
Viewed as allowing the variety of choice. Everybody's speaking that communist regime is suppressing freedom, things like that. Well, offering this material, at the end, you're offering the possibility to compare and to get access to the originals. So I think that's also demonstrating not only ideology, I would also say it's demonstrating the rule, which I think you were speaking about, just giving maximum of good to the maximum of people. So it's, and space exploration at the end is not about ideology, it's at the end of saving the humanity. That's one observation.
But it's important as to who saves it. In the children's literature, seriously, in the children's literature, this sounds like a comedy act, I'm sorry. But I know in the children's literature, because I've been working on art in children's literature over the 20s and 30s, it is just the way it is in contemporary American films. America always saves the world. It then ruins it, but it saves it, okay? In the children's literature of the 20s and 30s, it is always the Russians who go to Africa and teach poor African children how to live, okay? Not only that, you have these, an article I just finished, you have these poor American children living in the land of excess, where they have too much of everything. Okay, and so they go to Russia to discover what is the true meaning of life, which is, of course, collectivity, lack of everything. Okay, so I mean, it's incredibly idealized. Okay, and together with this, for children also would be the life of Lenin, who sacrificed himself. Okay, who died from exhaustion. Okay, not from a stroke and paralysis, okay, but who died from exhaustion. And his was the exemplary children's life, because his older brother was executed, okay, and so he devoted himself entirely to this. But the focus is on him as a child, because it's what you talk about, the identity formation, okay, and it's a very ideologized, politicized identity formation in children's works. I mean, I went through tons of this stuff. It was actually, it's hilarious, because we laugh, but yes, no, the children actually imbibe this. I'm sorry, I didn't get it.
Yeah, you say we laugh, but you can laugh as much as you want. But actually, it was a very good way to prepare people for a happy life, because I think the freedom which in these for example, in the West, they always say yes, but the socialist or communist camp lacked the freedom. No, I think they had much more freedom than the Western campus, for one simple reason, like what is a freedom if not a freedom of self-realization and freedom of feelings? And I think this what exactly the West is missing. I traveled a lot and I can really see the difference. It started from this educational and literature, kids' literature. So the first freedom of self-realization is in the world of rarity, where more or less a cleaner is getting not exactly the same salary as the engineer, but you can. A professor, yes, a little bit more, but still you have a rich choice of the professions according to your own taste. Just try to do this in Italy. Everyone wants to be a doctor or a lawyer because of the money, and you get so many doctors who doesn't care about their job but only about the money, and some people who care about something else but have to do the lawyer because it's very profitable. So that is absolutely not freedom at all. And in some countries, people have the possibility to have their own family at the age of 40, 50 because of the social conditions. And I think in Bulgaria, in the USSR and other countries, it was possible to be right after the university because of the social state system and so on.
We're going to have this big discussion at the end of the conference, so let's not ruin the discussion for now. Let's not ruin it.
And we'll
Ruin the surprise for the discussion, we discuss there.
Thank you. I think we have to have a short break now. So
Short break because we have the film panel.